This is Pet Life Radio. Let's talk pets.
Welcome to Aquariumania on Pet Life Radio. I'm your host, Dr. Roy Anong, speaking to you from the University of Florida's Tropical Aquaculture Laboratory. Thanks for joining us. There are many common myths and misconceptions out there in the aquarium hobby that continue to live on. More experienced fish keepers know fact from fiction, but those new to aquarium keeping often must learn the truth the hard way. Dr. Denise Petty is an aquaculture extension veterinarian and a fish veterinarian, of course, at the University of Florida's College of Veterinary Medicine in Gainesville, Florida. An avid fish keeper herself, Dr. Petty works closely with the aquarium fish industry, veterinary students, and veterinarians as a clinician and an educator. Join us as Dr. Petty answers common hobbyist questions and teaches us the truth behind these myths. We'll be right back after these messages.
Molly, here's your dinner. Zeus, that's not your food.
Don't let that happen to your precious cat. Elevate your cat's eating experience with the Cat Tree Tray. The Cat Tree Tray keeps your cat's food off the floor and conveniently located on the cat tree. It's the perfect way to eat. It's a beautiful wrought iron tray that easily attaches to your cat tree and keeps dogs and other critters out of your cat's dish. A must for multi-pet households. There's a 6-inch tray for large bowls and a 4-inch tray for smaller bowls. Purchase your Cat Tree Tray today. Go right now to cattreetray.com. That's cattreetray.com. CATTREETRAY.com.
Let's Talk Pets on PetLifeRadio.com.
Back with Dr. Denise Petty, aquaculture extension veterinarian at the University of Florida's College of Veterinary Medicine, talking about aquarium myths and misconceptions. Hi, Dr. Petty. Thanks very much for joining us today.
Well, thanks for having me, Dr. Yanung.
I like to ask a lot of preliminary questions just about how you got interested in fish and the hobby. So let me start with my first favorite, which is how did you get interested in the aquarium hobby and what was your first fish?
Well, I've loved animals since I was a very young kid, and I love all animals, and that just naturally progressed to fish. And my first fish was a molly.
How old were you when you had the molly?
I don't remember how old I was when I first got my first little fish. I think I was around 11 or 12. It ended up not being a good experience because I accidentally lost her while I was cleaning the tank, and it broke my heart. And so I didn't keep fish for a long time.
Pretty traumatic.
It was traumatic.
Yeah, definitely. Now, I know because I've known you for a long time that you used to be a horse vet. So how did you get interested in becoming a veterinarian to begin with, and then how did you make the leap from working with horses and more kind of farm animals to working with fish?
Well, because of my love for animals, ever since I was a very young child, I've always been fascinated with them and loved them, and I really couldn't stand to see them, injured or in pain, and so that's really how I ended up in the veterinary field, is because I wanted to be able to make a difference in their life. And my original goal, like you said, was to be an equine veterinarian, and I spent quite a few years doing an ambulatory equine practice. But I happened to set up a fish tank maybe 4 or 5 years after graduating from veterinary school, and I became so fascinated by it. I started setting up more tanks like so many people do, and then I got interested in doing medicine with these animals, and I slowly transitioned from equine practice to the fish practice over a period of probably 2 or 3 years.
Now, I think I seem to recall you also used to work at or own or run a pet store. Is that right?
That is correct. I did that in between when I was so wanting to get into fish medicine. I actually did. I operated a pet store with half of it was devoted to fishes in the process of trying to transition from the equine practice to fish medicine.
And then you also worked as a fish farm consultant and And also, I know you were the veterinarian for a long time for one of the really large wholesalers in Florida for seagrass. Can you talk about that real briefly?
Yes, I did some consulting for some of the fish farms when I was really trying to, kind of get my foot in the door to working with fish professionally. And then I was fortunate enough to get a position as the staff veterinarian for seagrass farms, where I was able to work with, thousands and thousands of fishes and many, many different species. So I was able to get a lot of good experience there.
Now, you're currently aquatic medicine faculty at UF. So what is your kind of general pattern or your duties for UF?
Well, my position is similar to yours, and we both provide extension through doing diagnostics primarily for the farms in Florida, and also diagnostics for public aquaria, and some education. I do a little bit of teaching of different, both college and workshops with some of the county extension agents that we have here in Florida, and a little bit of research.
And I know you have a pretty good number of aquariums at your place currently. So how many tanks do you have, and what are your favorite fish currently? Well,
right now I have 15 tanks set up. And my favorite fish, I like so many, but if I had to pick out, I couldn't pick out just one. But if I was going to pick out a couple, I would say loaches. I love loaches. I love some of the unusual cichlids and some of the little tetras. I've got a tank with a bunch of different pencil fish species, which I adore.
You're definitely one of those crazy aquarium people, as well as being a fish veterinarian, so that's great. Now, I wanted to start talking a little bit about some of the common hobbyist myths and misconceptions as we are kind of devoting this show to. There's some real general ones, and some of these are maybe even sort of questions that some of these hobbyists have. So I think one of the questions / myths is, that a fish stays just as big as the size of the tank that it's in. Can you tell us a little bit about that one?
I certainly can. And I'm sure you've heard this often too, and that is a pretty common misconception. But unfortunately, there is a little hint of truth in it for certain fish species. But the real story is unless the fish is malnourished or is starved or kept in really horrible water quality conditions, it's going to grow to the size that it should grow. And a lot of times, because we are giving our fish usually pretty good nutrition, many times they tend to grow a little bit bigger in captivity than they would in the wild. So if you think you can keep a goldfish in a bowl for all of its life, which could be 15 to 20 years, it would be a pretty awful place for that little fish to live.
One of the common questions, I think, and maybe, again, maybe myths depending on what numbers you're given, but is, you got to keep a certain number of inches of a fish per gallon of water. What's your read on that?
Well, it may work for some fishes. I think most people tend to use that 1 inch per gallon rule, and that may work for certain small-bodied fishes like neon tetras. But if you think about a fish that's an inch long, and I can think of lots of them that will be an inch long when they're juveniles, but compare, for example, a little Oscar that's 1 inch long to a neon tetra, and the difference in the body mass is dramatically different. And so that rule cannot be applied uniformly, given all of the different species that we keep as pets.
Yeah, that makes sense. You mentioned the 15 to 20 years, maybe average or approximately for goldfish. How long do fish live? That's another kind of big question.
Well, a lot depends on the species, but surprisingly, some fish that people usually think of as being very short-lived, like I can think of tetras, for example, some of those can live for 10 years or even longer. I've kept little dwarf rasboras, the little maculatus. They're very small fish, and the tendency would be to think that those little guys aren't going to live very long. But I've had them go for at least 8 to 10 years. So I think fish can live a lot longer than we want to give them credit for. And there are a few fish species that are known to have a shorter lifespan, for the bettas, for example. But I think most fish would live a very long time as long as we give them the proper care that they need.
That makes sense, definitely. I wanted to talk maybe a little bit about some of these disease issues now. And I've heard, and I'm sure you have heard many, many times that, someone tells you that their fish has a fungus. Go into the whole fungus mythology for us, if you don't mind.
Well, to begin with, what most people see as a fungus, which we tend to think of usually call saprolegnia, it's not a fungus at all. It's actually a water mold, which are type of a protozoan, not that different from some of the protozoan parasites that we treat in fishes. They just have a different type of lifestyle. And they're very important saprophytes, and they live in all freshwater environments. So pretty much, all of our fish tanks are going to have these water moles present in them, and they're not really out to attack fish as much as normally they're going to get rid of dead material. And sometimes if fish have damaged skin from fighting or from mishandling with a net, sometimes there will be, or I also add to that list, bad water quality conditions. Then it is possible that the saprolegnia, the water moles, may begin growing on that damaged area. And they do have the capacity to invade normal tissue, and that's where they can be a problem. One of the problems with trying to make a diagnosis for these water moles from just looking at a fish, there are so many different pathogens or disease-causing agents that can look so similar when you're just looking at that fish swimming around in the tank. I've had people say, well, my fish has the fungus, but it turned out to be a parasite called Epistylus instead. And so you never know until you actually do an examination and using a microscope to determine actually what is going on.
So you think kind of just looking at the fish and figuring what it looks like based on just a gross exam is really not the best way to go?
Definitely not. I've been working with fish professionally as a veterinarian for many years, and I would never make a diagnosis just by looking at a fish swimming around in a tank. I could certainly make a list of possibilities, but I've done it before, and then once I examined it using a microscope, I found out that I was completely wrong. So I don't think that's something that can be done, at least be done accurately.
Now, another disease I think some of the hobbyists have probably heard of, or at least maybe the intermediate or more advanced have heard of, is hole-in-the-head disease. And I know kind of out there in some of the literature and some of the hobbyist magazines, they talk about this hole-in-the-head disease being caused by a parasite. Can you talk a little bit about hole-in-the-head disease and some of the kind of mythology of that?
Sure. Well, hole-in-the-head disease, it's not uncommon to see this, at least in my experience, in large members of the cichlid family, like large pike cichlids, Oscars, but it can happen in other fishes too. And a lot of times these fish will appear to develop holes or pitting, typically associated with the head, but sometimes it may be behind the head. And the fish, they'll continue to act pretty normal, but it's unsightly. It's not a cosmetic thing. It doesn't look very nice on the fish. And there were at least one, maybe two papers that mention an association of these skin lesions in these fish with the parasite called spironucleus. The old name was Octomytus. And this parasite is commonly an internal parasite. It's found usually in the lower intestine of the fish. It's a little flagellated protozoan parasite, so it's just a single-celled. And it's not uncommon to find this parasite in the intestine of angelfish, discus, gouramis. I wouldn't say that it's common in all fish, but certain fishes do seem to be more susceptible to this parasite. But the papers that talked about the link, for those of us who are working with fishes a lot, and we see this parasite often when we're examining fish, and the fish often are sick from the parasite in their intestine, but these fish have no skin lesions whatsoever. And I've worked with a few of these fishes that are showing these skin lesions, and I've never seen a parasite associated with it. And actually, that it's kind of a big mystery at this point is what is causing this. We have lots of things that we think are, and more than likely, they're probably some type of water quality issue, perhaps nutritional. No one's really been able to put a finger on it. We know in marine fish that the dust from granular activated carbon can cause skin lesions. And whether that may happen in freshwater, more than likely it will, but I don't think anyone has looked at that yet. But as far as the hole in the head being caused by a parasite, I don't think there's a strong evidence to prove that.
Okay. Now, I guess, and that goes to maybe the follow-up question, which would hint at some of the stuff you're saying. So when there are treatments out there for a hole in the head, what do you think of treatment for a specific disease sign like a hole in the head lesion?
Well, because hole in the head is a clinical sign of a disease, it'd be nice to make a specific diagnosis. I don't have any confidence that I could pick up a medication that is labeled for treating hole in the head, that it's going to work. I wouldn't do that. I would work on trying to diagnose why this fish has developed the skin lesions in the first place, and then treat whatever I find from my diagnostics.
Yeah, that makes sense, definitely. And I think that kind of reinforces what you had talked about earlier in terms of even the fungus, knowing actually what the real problem is, and maybe, having to use a microscope or other methods to really figure out what the problem is. Well, I have a lot more questions for you, Dr. Petty, and hopefully we can continue to break down even more of these aquarium myths. But first, let's take a real short break and listen to messages from our sponsors.
It's DesignerPetSweaters.com. Hand-knitted designer sweaters for your precious pup or cool cat. Beautiful couture patterns for your pets, including custom-knitted formal wear, casual wear, yachting, and even sports-themed. Many designer pet sweaters include feathered tammy hats, top hats, and a lot of sparkle. Each sweater includes leg loops, front paw sleeves, and leash opening. Visit DesignerPetSweaters.com to order your four-legged fashions today. Your pets will stay warm for the winter and be runway ready. Large or small, we fit them all. DesignerPetSweaters.com.
Let's talk pets
Let's talk pets
on Pet Life Radio.
Pet Life Radio.
PetLifeRadio.com.
We're back and continuing our conversation with my guest, Dr. Denise Petty, aquaculture extension veterinarian at the University of Florida. We talked in the earlier half of the show a little bit about some of the common diseases. I had a few more I wanted to ask you, kind of myth related. Now, people talk about their fish having flukes. Can you sort of talk about the whole disease issue and what flukes actually are and why people maybe are actually misspeaking when they say that?
Certainly. Flukes is a term that's been used for a long time, and most of the time it's incorrect. There was a time when the things that we call skin flukes and gill flukes were thought to be closely related to trematodes. In fact, they were called monogenetic trematodes. But for the last 20 years of research and a lot of experts looking at these, it turns out that while they are flatworms, like the true flukes are, number one, they are not trematodes, and they're not flukes. So the proper terminology would be to call them monogenians or the monogenes. I've heard a few people call them skin worms or gill worms, and that's much more accurate than calling them a skin fluke or a gill fluke. The true flukes are the trematodes that also typically are digenes, and they have a completely different life cycle, and it's important not to confuse the two groups of flatworms.
Yeah, you mentioned, I guess, life cycle, so that's probably why, because of how you would handle the disease if you had it. Is that right?
That's correct. So, in fact, the term monogenian, that means one generation. So the monogenes actually can easily go from fish to fish, whereas the trematodes, the true flukes, have a complex life cycle that involves multiple different types of hosts, and usually starting with some type of aquatic mollusk like a snail, then can either be use an intermediate host, which may be a fish, and then go into a final host, which in many of the fishes that we work with would be aquatic birds, but it could easily be other animals. There are so many, I think there's over 100,000 trematode species, so there's some variations in that life cycle, but they're all complex and they all require multiple stages. However, back with the monogenians, which is probably, that group is the most important parasitic group that's not a protozoan, I think, on fishes, and probably causes more damage. But they are not flukes nor are they trematodes. But because they do go easily from fish to fish, they're a little bit more easily controlled than the true flukes would be.
Now, another common sort of "my fish has" statement that we hear a lot from some of the beginning hobbyists and even more intermediate or advanced is that my fish has ick. Can you talk a little bit about ick and signs for ick and kind of the difficulties with maybe saying that all the time?
Certainly. There are Ichthyopteris multifilius, which is why it's such a long word, is why we tend to shorten it down to ick. It's a lot easier to say. It's a parasite. It's not the most common protozoan parasite in fishes, but it's certainly one that can be easily seen externally without using usually any special types of equipment. mainly because it can appear to be like white dots or almost like salt crystals on the skin of the fish. But unfortunately, there's a lot of other parasites out there that can cause very similar signs or have an appearance just like a fish that has ick. So that's something, again, if I saw a fish that had these white spots, it's important to do a diagnosis, to try to take a look at some of those little things, white dots, underneath the microscope and figure out what they are. And one of the problems with ick, and it is important to make a diagnosis as quickly as possible. I consider this parasite, if I diagnose it, that it requires emergency treatment because it can be devastating to a fish, any fish that's exposed to it, because it can affect so many fish so many quickly.
So now sometimes, a hobbyist will, or even, some of the producers we work with, will treat when they see a fish that has been diagnosed, correctly for ick, and they'll come back and say, well, I treated it, but it still has the white spots, the next day. Can you explain why that's maybe confusing for some folks?
Certainly, because when we're seeing those white spots on that fish, they look like they're sitting on top of the skin of the fish. But in reality, they're actually protected. They're actually underneath the skin. So when we put that treatment into our aquarium, we're not actually touching the parasite. The fish is being exposed, but the parasite isn't being exposed. And as part of they have this complicated life cycle, and as part of that life cycle, while they're underneath the skin of the fish, they're actually feeding on the fish, and they're extremely irritating, which is why some fish will jerk around or try to rub against objects in the aquarium to, because these little organisms are feeding on them. After they develop underneath the skin for a certain, depends on water temperature, they actually come out of the fish, make a hole back in the skin and come out, and then they develop. And it's when they come off the fish is that we have an opportunity to kill them. But until that time, there's nothing that we can do. So just putting the treatment into the water is going to do absolutely nothing for those white spots until several days later.
Okay, that makes sense. And hopefully folks will kind of understand that. So it definitely takes a while for any ick outbreak to be treated effectively because of the differences in the life stages and where they are located.
If I may mention, too, it usually takes more than one treatment, and it usually takes several weeks of treatments every other day. So it's not something that will just go away with a couple of treatments.
Okay. Now, let's talk a little bit about water quality. There's a lot of mythology with water quality and, again, some with a hint of truth depending on, the specific issue. So a real common one, of course, we hear all the time whenever there's a problem with a fish disease or a fish disease outbreak is that the water quality is fine. So, both, I know you hear that quite a bit. What do you usually think when someone tells you that their water quality is fine?
Well, I would like to have hard numbers. That's more meaningful for me because I don't know how they're testing. I don't know what parameters are being tested. So that usually I would ask a lot of questions in response to that statement to try to get more information, to get more specific what is being tested and what are the actual values.
What maybe values would be your top, 3, 4, 5 values that you should get the numbers for? Well,
certainly ammonia, nitrite, pH, alkalinity. If they're using salt for any reason, I would also measure salinity just to have an idea. At least those, although kind of depends on the situation. If it was a pond, I would also want to know dissolved oxygen, carbon dioxide.
Okay. So, yes, definitely sounds like there's a lot more to water quality than just, one or two things that people need to consider. Yeah, because I know often it seems as though people will focus on maybe things like pH or some one or two parameters rather than the big picture. So speaking of pH, what is the best pH for keeping aquarium fish? You hear that a lot. A lot of times people are asking, and what's your take on that?
Well, I think we're pretty lucky with freshwater fish in that most of them are pretty adaptable to a wide range of pH. And in fact, that range is considered to be 6.0 to 9.0, although I certainly wouldn't recommend that people keep fish at a pH at 9.0, even if that's an acceptable range. And even fishes coming from the wild where the pH is much lower, in my experience, they acclimate very well to pH within that range. And the critical thing is trying to keep it stable. I used to live in Central Florida where the water tended to have a high pH because it had high alkalinity. And I kept successfully fishes that have a reputation for not being able to keep in such water, such as discus and some other low pH fishes. They did quite well for me in a pH of anywhere from 8.2 to 8.3.
So it sounds like there definitely is a lot more flexibility with these, and so I'm guessing acclimation and maybe some of the other parameters, if they're kept really optimal, then the pH is probably not as critical as some people think.
Yes, it certainly seems to be that way.
Now, another big problem or question folks have, is especially those that are living in areas that use chlorines and chloramines for disinfection, is how to get rid of that. Now, people talk about aging water for several days being better than using chemicals. What's your take on that when people say that?
I would not rely on aging water. And much depends on the chemical that the water company is using, whether it's chlorine or chloramine. Chlorine will dissipate. It can take as much as 20 hours for each milligram per liter of chlorine in the water. And most of the water companies are trying to deliver a pretty high dose, anywhere from 1.5 to 2 milligrams per liter of chlorine to the tap. And that's extremely toxic to most fishes. So to have that water just sit there and not do anything with it, it's so much safer and better for the fish to use something to neutralize the chlorine, and so that you're confident that there's nothing left. And as far as chloramine is even more toxic to fish than chlorine is, and it will not go away. In fact, that's one reason many of the companies are using that, is because it has what we call a very long residual, which means it's active for a very long time. And it does eventually break down, but you can't expect it to be completely gone. So it's pretty risky. Both of the compounds are so toxic to fish, it's just not worthwhile to take a risk.
Along the same lines, there are folks that will have problems, and they've dechlorinated their water, so they pretty much have ruled out chlorine as an issue. Is that something that's valid, do you think, or is there potential that they may be wrong?
I think the only way to be sure is to do a test and see if chlorine or chloramine are present. That's the only way to be positive. I mentioned that the water company is usually trying to deliver that 1.5 to 2 milligrams per liter, but sometimes they have to use higher doses to kill certain pathogens. If for any reason fecal coliforms have gotten in the water supply, they're going to use a very high dosage of chlorine or chloramine to make sure that the water is cleaned up and is safe for human consumption. And it may be so high, or there may be enough residual, that the normal dose of the neutralizer that's being used will not take care of that extra amount of chlorine or chloramine that's left over. Another time that can be risky is whenever there's a new water pipe being added to a line, because they usually use really high doses of chlorine to try to clean that pipe up before they start running the water through it. And that can also be risky too.
Okay, so you may actually have these slugs of chlorine going through just because of what's going on in the line.
Exactly. When I had the pet store, I lost several tanks of fish to exactly that when I was doing water changes at night. The first couple of tanks were okay, and then as I was changing water in some of the other tanks, the fish were dying extremely quickly. And that's one of the other problems with chlorine. If there's a large slug coming through, again, that toxicity is such a small amount that will kill fish. By the time you see that there's a problem, it's usually too late. You cannot act quickly enough to neutralize the chlorine, unfortunately.
Continuing on with water quality, another myth is if you've got really good biofiltration, kind of breaking down your ammonia and everything, you really don't need to change water because everything's being taken care of by the biofilter. What's the truth about that statement?
Well, it's nice to have a really good biofilter, but that biofilter, when it's breaking down the ammonia and nitrite, it's actually producing nitrate and organic acids, and it's also in the process, and this is a requirement for the bacteria that are doing this, they have to have a carbon source, which usually is in the form of bicarbonate, and that's where the alkalinity comes up. And so for each 1 gram of ammonia that biofilter oxidizes to nitrite and then to nitrate, it needs 7.4 grams of bicarb. And there are a lot of people who live in areas where the water that they're using in their tank is naturally low in alkalinity or low in bicarb. And that's something, if they're not testing for, they may not realize that. And over time, this biofilter is going to consume this alkalinity to the point that there may be no buffering capacity, so that the pH may crash or become very acidic, or it may become very basic. and it's possible to have catastrophic fish death due to these dramatic pH changes.
So, bottom line, you really want to be checking a lot of these different parameters, ideally, just to make sure none of this is happening. Is that right?
Oh, definitely. Number one, you need to know about the water that you're using to fill the tank up before the fish even go in it. So you have a kind of an idea of what you may have to deal with as far as your fish. And the other thing is to check that tank periodically and monitor these different things that are going on. Is there ammonia? Is there enough alkalinity for that biofilter to run? At the same time, so once all the alkalinity is gone, once there's no bicarb available for these nitrifying bacteria living in the biofilter, then they're not going to continue to break down the ammonia and the nitrite. So then that means that it'll start accumulating in the water, and if you don't test for any of these, you would never know it.
Very good. Good advice. Well, I had two more real quick questions. Now, people seem to think that if they use pure water, meaning, distilled water or, deionized or reverse osmosis water, that's actually the best water to use for their aquarium. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, a lot of people will use that type of water when they're making up a marine mix for marine fish, and that's okay. But for freshwater fish, it's absolutely the worst possible water that you could use if that's all you're using. And the reason is that these fish have electrolytes or salts within their bloodstream, very similar to us, and they're living in an environment that usually has very little of those salts. And they're always having to work very hard to try to keep the water in the environment from flooding their body. And they do this by using these electrolytes. So when you put them in water like distilled or deionized or reverse osmosis, which is as pure as possible, and it usually has no minerals, no electrolytes in it, that makes it really difficult for that fish to maintain its internal osmotic balance or homeostasis. So I would not recommend ever using that unless it's being mixed with water that does contain the desirable minerals that they need. For example, like calcium, magnesium, a little bit of sodium, and some chloride is always good for fish to have some of that in their water.
Okay, so if someone's using distilled water for their aquarium, basically their fish is not going to be happy and probably end up dying.
Exactly. They may not die right away, but over time, they'll be working so hard to try to survive in that type of environment. Eventually, they may have renal failure or be flooded out with that water.
Now, kind of the reverse of that, so to speak, there's some people that say, or maybe that certain fishes should not have any salt or can't handle really even low levels of salt in their aquaria. Can you talk real briefly about that?
Certainly. I personally love salt for fish under certain conditions. I certainly don't keep freshwater fish in salt all the time unless they do have a requirement for it. But under certain conditions, especially if a fish has some type of disease of the skin or the gills, salt is fantastic for osmoregulatory support, which basically means that we're just trying to give it the ions that it needs to, again, maintain its normal bodily function. And for a fish that is heavily parasitized or has an external bacterial infection, so there's lots of skin damage or there's lots of gill damage, these fish will be constantly struggling not only to fight off the infection, but trying to maintain that optimal electrolyte balance within their body. And that damaged skin and those damaged gills are going to allow the water from the environment to flood in. So if we add some salt, just plain sodium chloride, it actually helps it make that environment more osmotically friendly, can I say. So that it's a little bit easier for them to maintain that optimal electrolyte balance.
And I guess maybe just to do a quick follow-up, what kind of salt would you recommend for freshwater fish then? And is there a problem with using salt that's got, iodized salt?
Number one, if someone's going to use salt, I know some people will use the water softener salt, but you have to be very cautious that there are no anti-caking agents in the salt. You want to use a salt that is 100% sodium chloride. As for your other question,
about use of iodized salt?
Yes, table salt. Well, I had a veterinary student did a little project with that a couple of years ago, and her results, she used it with koi, several species, guppy, koi, and a South American cichlid. And she used iodized salt at the levels that we would normally recommend for like 3 grams per liter or 3 parts per thousand, and there was no toxicity in any of those 3 species. And it turns out that the amount of iodine that is actually in the salt is extremely low level, and it's very unlikely that you'll ever cause iodine toxicity by using table salt.
Well, that's great. Very good to know. Unfortunately, we're out of time. I have a lot more questions to ask, and I'm sure I'll have to have you back on at some point. I want to thank you very much, Dr. Petty, and also our producers, especially Mark Winter, for making this show possible. Dr. Petty, did you have any final thoughts for our listeners?
Well, I think it's important that we do the best we can to take care of these animals. We need to provide them a fantastic environment. If that means that we need to check these different water quality parameters and make sure that's what's happening. Another thing to look at would be providing proper nutrition and just doing the best we can to take care of them. They're fantastic animals, and we can learn a lot from them. And I want to thank you, too.
Oh, you're welcome. And I definitely wanted to, it sounds like we may want to do a plug for working with veterinarians as well to kind of actually figure out what's going on.
Oh, definitely. Please just don't look at the fish and think that you can make a diagnosis, because I'm not even comfortable doing that. And I'm sure that you too, Dr. Yanung, are not comfortable making a diagnosis that way. So it's very important to have some professional help in making a decision.
Well, thank you very much again, Dr. D, for joining us. I encourage all of you to visit my Aquariumania blog on Pet Life Radio. Also, if you have any questions, comments, or ideas for a show, email me at drroy, that's D-R-R-O-Y, at petliferadio.com, drroy at petliferadio.com. If you're ever in Florida, please be sure to visit the Aquariumania exhibit at the Florida Aquarium in Tampa, one of my favorite aquariums. Until next time, please visit your local aquarium stores, buy more fish, but be sure to keep your tanks and your fish healthy.
Let's Talk Pets, every week on demand, only on PetLifeRadio.com.